I'm Craig. Hello, nice to meet you,
Hi,
dude.
Craig. Nice to meet you.
50 years in showbiz, or almost 50 years in showbiz. And of course, you became hugely loved for roles like Little House on the Prairie and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. But do you remember your very first ever TV role?
The part where I earned my Screen Actors Guild card, which is always a big moment for any young actor, was on the streets of San Francisco. And I was a malicious prank phone caller, and I get busted by Karl Malden and Richard Hatch, who had taken over for Michael Douglas in the last season of Streets of San Francisco.
Yeah.
I was raised in the San Francisco Bay Area. Anybody who was going to do small parts locally was going to be doing them on the streets of San Francisco. There were other parts, but that was the first one. That was a big moment. I'll tell you, the thrill for me of that first job was when the dressing room trailer drove by. You know, these there are honey wagons. So these are dressing rooms that are pulled but on the back of a truck. The big thrill for me, Craig, was seeing my name on the dressing room door when the honey wagon pulled up to the location where I was waiting. That was pretty cool. That said to me, wow, I'm in the process of arriving.
You got to hang with the great Karl Malden. What was that like?
No kidding. He was one of the greats. He represented a kind of a gravitas for actors. I mean, you knew when you were in a space, when you were with Karl, and he treated everyone wonderfully. He was my recollection of that experience is that he was a very, very gracious man. He liked actors. And I think he really liked working with young actors. So he was just as gracious and easy, and he made someone doing their first dialogue feel like they belonged there with him. That was really the gift. Craig, one of my favorite opening title sequences of all time is that Streets of San Francisco opening title and the great voiceover that led you into this was the sort of the style of Quinn Martin, which was the production company that made Streets of San Francisco. This was their style.
Let's hop back to the start. You mentioned, of course, growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area, but you were born in British Columbia. So what took you to San Francisco?
My father was in the United States Air Force after the Korean War. So at that point in time, in the Cold War, there was a lot of concern about the Soviet Union coming over the pole to attack the continental United States. And so the United States military had a presence in Canada, particularly in the northern part of Canada. Prince George, BC was way north in Canada on the western side of the country. And, my parents got married and my father was stationed there and they went to Prince George and there I was born. I have to tell you, I was there for the first 6 months of my life. I've heard stories about it. I've never been back to Prince George, British Columbia, since moving back to California in the 6 months after I was born. I mean, basically, I spent my first Christmas in the San Francisco Bay Area after being born on May 20th, 1956. So that was then. I'm about to celebrate my, just after this interview or just before this interview comes on, I will have celebrated my 68th birthday.
You just described your father being in the Air Force. I'm assuming your mother really had no attachment to showbiz. How were you bitten by that bug, to use a very old, rather tired cliche?
Yeah, no, like so many kids, Craig, I wanted to be seen and heard. That was a really important thing. Was looking for some acceptance and invisible acceptance. I did not think it would come from acting. In 8th grade, I did a little play and was cast in a little play in an English class, and I had 3 lines and forgot 2 of them in the performance. So, this did not seem like a really target-rich environment for me. I was just shy and uncomfortable with myself. 2 years later, I had the opportunity to begin announcing basketball games for our varsity basketball team. I was sitting at the scorer's table, and the faculty advisor who had invited me to keep the official score book — there's always an official book where all the scores are put in — invited me to introduce the starting lineups before that first game began. And I have to tell you, it was like one of these moments in a movie where the room goes dark and a pin spot comes down on the microphone sitting on the table. It was one of those old Shure pedestal microphones that was this microphone was quite old at that point, but it was this shining light on this microphone. And I really saw my whole life open up in that moment. And speaking into the microphone, hearing my voice, having people applaud what I was saying. They weren't applauding me, they were applauding the players in the game. But it was really among the first times in my life, Craig, where I felt like I was being heard, really heard. And that led to wanting to get on the stage. And I felt, as is so often the case with young guys, I followed a girl I had a crush on into the theater at my high school, and for a production of Once Upon a Mattress, the great musical that Carol Burnett became famous for in 1959. And I joined the chorus and was a knight in the chorus and loved the lights and the applause and all of that. And that really hooked me.
Your first major movie role was 1978, and it was a TV movie with Stephanie Zimbalist, and that was called Forever. And that was a romance movie, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was a first love movie. It was based on a book by a wonderful author named Judy Blume, who has been very famous for really the telling of coming of age stories. And of course, I was fortunate enough to meet a very good friend there and in Stephanie Zimbalist, who became a wonderful friend of mine, and other people I worked with. And Stephanie and I understood each other when we met immediately. Now, Stephanie comes from a long, deeply rooted entertainment industry family, with obviously her father, Ephraim Zimbalist Jr., who became a staple to television audiences around the world.
Oh, a legend.
Great career. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And a lovely, lovely guy. I mean, Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. was as gracious a gentleman as you would ever want to meet. And I immediately felt a commonality with her family. So it was a very, and that sort of thing, you sort of know that stuff in seconds when you meet somebody. You pick up on a lot of things, and Stephanie just radiated something that I was very familiar with and comfortable with. And so I think that really helped us when we read together. And of course, it fueled a friendship that's gone on for close to 50 years.
But, you played Almanzo Wilder on Little House on the Prairie. It turns out, doesn't it, Dean, that everybody was pronouncing Almanzo wrong because they were saying Almanzo Wilder, where it's Almanzo Wilder, right?
That was one of those bizarre things. Now, all during the audition, it was Almanzo. That's what people were saying, and that's what our casting director was saying in the meetings. And Lucy Lee Flippen, who played my sister Eliza Jane, said it on camera the first time we worked together. And
this is my brother, Almanzo.
I had no reason to question this. I had not read the Little House books growing up. I had never seen an episode of the series, although that wouldn't have helped with the Almanzo situation. But I had no background with this material before being cast in it to do it. So there was nothing that triggered any sort of questioning in me as to, are we pronouncing this name correctly? It maybe should have, but it didn't. Well, when my episodes began airing in September of 1979, there were letters immediately from a great many Laura Ingalls Wilder aficionados who grew up on these books and knew them very, very well, and were telling us that we were mispronouncing the name. Well, Michael Landon, being the guy that he was, and listen, I was not going to bring these letters to his attention. That was not my place to do that. Michael was in charge. He was the man. The decisions around the series were his. I noted that we were getting these letters, but because Michael said said the name is Almanzo, that was good enough for me. I was not going to question Michael's take on this. It wasn't until years later, until 2008, when I was in Malone, New York, upper state New York, at Almanzo Wilder's childhood home, about which Laura wrote Farmer Boy, that I found a recording in their little gift store called Laura Speaks. And it was a 27-second recording on a CD disc. And just very simple. I guess Laura must have been recorded in the late 40s or early 50s, perhaps. And they had this little section of it. And she very, very clearly stated that she talked about very clearly the man of the house, Almanzo. And that was really, Craig, the first time that I knew for an absolute certainty that we had been doing this wrong.
Look, what was Michael Landon like? Because he wore so many hats. You know, he was an actor, he was the executive producer, he was essentially the boss because he was also the director and the writer. How does somebody like that do so much at the one time?
It's an extraordinary catalog of accomplishment that Michael had. I mean, there's no doubt. You know, I think Michael was aided by the fact that he had 14 years on Bonanza to apprentice. Not only so he came in obviously to Bonanza to be this young heartthrob, but I think that Michael was so bright, and you could tell this as I started working with him. When Michael wasn't directing, he could get really bored just being on the set. He needed that stimulation that came from being a director, and I can imagine, knowing Michael's sense of humor and sort of the way he could comport himself, he could be a little bit of trouble if he got bored, because, you know, he was a practical joker and he would start saying things and doing things. And so it was probably much better. It was better to have Michael on the set when he was acting and directing, because he was really focused on what he was trying to accomplish that day, and he was brilliant at it. And he had 14 years on Bonanza to test acting, really establish his persona as an actor on the screen in front of the camera.
Yes.
And then he became, I can't tell you at what point during the run of Bonanza that he began to take an interest in directing, but clearly that took root, and he was working with a group of people who were in management of the show, who were running the show, who were receptive to his interests. And I have an idea that Michael probably was so dogged about his insistence about wanting to direct and wanting to learn to write that, and I can just imagine that. I mean, Michael was not a guy, he was not a shrinking violet in any sense of the word. If he wanted something, he was going to let you know that he wanted something. Well, he honed his craft as a director, and the story about him as a writer was terrific. They said apparently one Friday at Bonanza, it was announced that they were going to have to not work on Monday because they did not have a script ready for Monday to start shooting. And Michael went to the executive producer, a man named David Dortort, and said to David, if I can give you a script by Sunday, can we shoot on Monday? And David Dortort apparently said, oh, sure. Yeah, we can do that. If you could, yeah, I mean, if you have a script for us on Sunday, yeah, we can maybe do that. Well, I don't know if David Dortort believed that Michael could come up with a script, but by God, Michael went home on that Friday night, and Sunday afternoon, a draft of the script hit David Dortort's doorstep, and he read it, and they prepped it and shot it starting Monday morning. And Michael just had an uncanny sense of story, of compelling issues and drama that could drive stories forward. And I think so much of that came from the fact, Craig, that Michael, and you may know this and your audience may know this, but I'll just share it. Michael grew up in a very unhappy family environment. He was, he did not grow up in a loving home. His parents really didn't speak to each other. They apparently didn't like each other very much. And so Michael was learning survival skills within his family at a very early age. And I think it was here that in that area that he developed his humor and his sense of pathos about things. I mean, and when you think about that, coming from a really unhappy home, Michael could have become something very different than what he became. But he obviously had a desire to transform whatever he had into something good. He took those experiences and made them into a positive thing. And his work as a writer was touching. It was emotional. It elicited an emotional response in people who read it. And this is where Michael's strongest writing was in these stories of heartbreak and disappointment, tragedy. This is where he really, really scored as a writer. And I can't help but believe that it was those struggling years that he had growing up in an unhappy home that gave him the tools to step into his imagination and play in that area. And
no doubt you are right. No doubt. Karen Grassle told me that he was incredible as a writer, incredible on so many levels, but incredible as a writer because he could literally write on the fly the way it would take people months to put together a storyline, and yet Michael could just pull it out of thin air like that, and it was pitch perfect.
Yeah, there were a lot of it. Karen would be someone who would have watched that for years. Michael would, in between, I mean, imagine this. Michael is starring in this show, so he's got responsibilities in front of the camera constantly. And in those early years, he was always on camera. And then very often he is directing. Now, Michael didn't direct every episode, but he directed a good number of them, and always the big ones in the series. Add to that, then, Michael is writing an episode, and literally Michael was left-handed. He did not write with a typewriter. He wrote left-handed, as a left-handed person would, with a yellow legal pad in his lap. And we would sit and watch him, writing these scenes out in longhand.
Yes.
And those yellow legal pads would go to his secretary back at the studio, and they would be translated into the white pages of the next script or the script after that. But you are exactly right. And Karen was right. He just had this uncanny, clear sense of straightforward dialogue. He never overwrote scenes. It was minimalist dialogue. It sounded like people when people talked. I mean, he wrote as people spoke, and he was able to move through an idea so efficiently that he wrote the number of scripts that he wrote, and I think he wrote something like 60 episodes of the 210 episodes that the series did. He rewrote every episode. So his stamp, whether it was a lot or a little, was on every single episode of the series that was done.
Yes.
He really was an extraordinary person. Now, add to that, Michael Landon, when you met him, was nothing like Charles Ingalls. I mean, there was just no Charles. You did not see Charles Ingalls in Michael. When I met Michael the first time, and I didn't know what to expect when I was going to go into the room to meet him for the first time. But when I went into the room to meet him, here's a guy with this deep, dark tan. I mean, he'd obviously just gotten back from Hawaii, where he always visited. I mean, Michael had, when you say dark tan, I mean, it was a dark tan. He had the ash brown dye #2 and the hair that's sort of cascading off of his head, the gold-rimmed Carrera sunglasses, gold chains around the neck, a chambray blue shirt open halfway down his chest, jeans sprayed on with a gun, and snakeskin boots. I mean, a cigarette in his teeth, with these gleaming white teeth, as he said hello to you and laughed. And I'm thinking, this is not Charles Ingalls sitting in front of me. This is like if there were a definition of big time television star and the picture of what that looked like in the dictionary, it would have been Michael Landon. And this was a glossy, bigger than life character, and he radiated confidence and sex appeal. And so, I mean, there was a lot of power that was coming off of this guy all the time. And here you realize you're dealing with someone really who's totally in charge of their talent, because then on the set, on the stage, I mean, Michael always looked amazing on camera. I mean, there's, no question he was a great looking man, always a great looking man, but you didn't get any sense as you watched him on the screen as Charles Ingalls of the gold Carrera sunglasses and the cigarette and the teeth and the gold chains and all that. He understood his persona. He understood what this character required, and he was able to dial himself down to this very naturalistic, easy, accessible energy. And audiences loved him for this. I mean, Michael was America's favorite dad.
Loved all over the world, Dean. And the thing is, if anybody went against that particular well-honed image of Michael Landon as being this Mr. Perfect, for instance, Karen Grassle, she wrote her book. Though she respected the man's immeasurable talent and what he meant to so many millions of people, she copped tremendous blowback because I suppose she shattered that Mr. Perfect image. And she, in her book, wrote about feeling kind of underappreciated, and she made a remark about being underpaid. Well, by gosh, did she cop a carpeting?
Yeah, she did. There's no question. I'm going to just say, look, everything that Karen says about Michael's abilities, absolutely true. I mean, this guy was absolute solid gold, 10 out of 10 in everything he was doing on that show. No, in every show Michael did, he was 10 out of 10. Awesome. Michael was also a tough businessman. He was a really tough businessman, and he knew his value, and he understood, I think he understood that he was the reason, at least initially, that people were tuning in. I don't think he had any illusion about that. He understood that completely. And and everyone who he cast other than Victor French was completely unknown to the television audience. It was about Michael. And he knew that, and he didn't have to pay big salaries to people. And that is what it is. I would say, I mean, look, I read Karen's book. I loved Karen's book. And for what it's worth, I think she reported that situation very accurately. Michael was a man of another time. He had a different take on men and women and how they interacted with each other. But I would say this also, I mean, I have no quibble with anything Karen wrote in her book and the way she wrote it. And I know that upset some people. And when there are people who are going to hear me, Craig, say this to you, and they're not going to be happy with me for saying it, because people want Michael to be the perfect human being. Michael was not a perfect human being. His own children know he wasn't a perfect human being. He was beloved and adored by television audiences, and he did something for family living as a creative person that was extraordinary. But Michael was not perfect, and I think it's unfair. It's unfair to anybody to put that tag on them. I mean, it may be nice, but it's not real. And but everybody had massive respect for Michael's abilities.
No doubt about it. No doubt. I remember reading, in fact, it was quite a heartbreaking interview. Kevin Hagen, of course, who played Doc Baker. And he gave an interview on his deathbed, I think in one of those scandal rags. So you take it with a pinch of salt the size of the world. But I mean, essentially, he was saying Michael Landon was this incredible, incredible person, an enormous talent. But he too felt a little bit kind of cheated and hard done by. And I can understand that's probably how he felt. Having said that, without Michael Landon, would Kevin Hagen have landed such a role of a lifetime? And acknowledged that himself as well.
Everyone, I don't think that there's anybody on our program that wouldn't acknowledge Michael's gifts and also acknowledge their gratitude for the opportunity that they had to be there. But no one, and I look, television salaries or salaries today for top flight, top of show actors are enormous compared to even what Michael was making in those years. I mean, it's like, you know, the money is just off the charts huge today. But, you know, Michael did not pay people. Now, Melissa Gilbert got paid in the latter years of the series. She made her, at one point, Melissa Gilbert at 16, 17 years old was the highest paid actress on NBC. And there were a lot of seasoned actresses working on NBC at that point, but Melissa Gilbert was making more than any of them. And in the context of our show, of this series, she had earned that right. I think that was probably a really hard-fought negotiation that went on. And I can't imagine that Michael let that happen easily. But I think he probably realized that, you know, she was earning it.
Yes. Michael's death from pancreatic cancer, and he'd been very public with his situation, Dean, which is tremendous kudos to him. He could have shut the door and not let anybody see, but he didn't. He went on talk shows. He was very candid about it. He wanted to bring the spotlight to the horrors of pancreatic cancer in the hope of funding research, all of that, which was extraordinary. Did you get the chance to say goodbye?
I did not feel it was my place to, I mean, at this very challenging time for he and his family. I think there were probably so many people who were reaching to him. Now, I know, I mean, like Karen spoke to him on the phone towards the end of his life. Melissa went and saw him towards the end of his life, and they had a coming together again over that after a couple of some difficult years. I wrote him a letter and wished him well and thanked him and encouraged and wrote a letter of it as much as I could encourage. You know, I think Michael went public with what he was going through, one, to bring awareness to it, one, in search of anybody, anywhere who was doing work on this that might give him an opportunity to extend his life through any kind of experimental treatment. He was willing to try anything at that point. He was, you know, he was very brave about it. He was very brave and very forthright about it. And this was, you know, big part of who he was. He had been a champion for social causes, social issues, writing about difficult issues, making shows about challenging things that people faced. And so when he found himself in this situation, facing pancreatic cancer, which at that point had, and I think it's still, I mean, the survival rate was virtually non-existent then. It's still, I believe, under 10% survival rate for pancreatic cancer. I mean, it's a virulent form of cancer that's very unforgiving. You know, gratefully, his children and those who loved him and cared about him have helped support research for pancreatic cancer, but there's a long way to go. There's a long way to go with that, but he did want to jumpstart it. The Pancreatic Cancer Association, or the Pancreatic Cancer Action Network, was founded largely on Michael Landon's vocalization of what he was facing. He was one of the first people in public life who faced this disease or faced this cancer that actually, as you're suggesting, went public with it. So he served a great deal. He did a great deal of good by bringing awareness to this, and that's part of who he was, and he was totally about that.
It lives on these decades on, doesn't it? His incredible good work there. And look, Melissa Gilbert, you referenced Melissa. She was Laura Ingalls, of course. You were married to her for your run on the show. But there was that first screen kiss with Melissa. Were you nervous, Dean?
I think we were both nervous about it for different reasons. I was nervous about it because this was America's sweetheart, and I don't think, it was very important that whatever this kiss was, that it never be a kind of a kiss that would have the audience feel for a moment that Melissa was in over her head, that she was being overwhelmed or pressured or any of that. The kiss had to be equal ground for both of us. We had to come at this kiss with an equal measure of naivete and hopes and dreams and all of that. That was really, really important. Now, I had a fair amount of life experience at 23, nearly 24 years old at that point. So, I'd had my share of first kisses. And I think, as much as we've talked for years about this being Melissa's first kiss, I have this feeling, Craig, that maybe there were a few other little kisses here and there.
Right.
That it was made more challenging, Craig, by the fact that her mom was there, and her mom, that's a tough deal to put somebody through.
That's a tough deal.
The sobbing happening. I mean, this was not tears of joy that Barbara was crying. I think she was flipped out that Melissa was having this kiss with someone that was a good deal older than she was. And like, where's this going from here? She blew 3 takes by bursting into tears before the kiss could actually take place. And Michael was close to Barbara. They were friends, but I think he got a little exasperated by the fact that she wrecked these takes. Finally, I think he went up to her and spoke to her and said, Barbara, we've got work to get done here. You need to get a grip on yourself. And I think Barbara covered her mouth, did whatever she did. We got through the 4th take and the kiss actually was able to take place. It was a simple, very sweet, chaste little kiss. It won TV Land's most memorable kiss.
Look, fans love that episode where you're set up on a date with Nellie Olson, and as I recall it, you say cinnamon chicken is your favorite dish.
Cinnamon chicken, which I've never had. I don't know if there is such a thing as cinnamon chicken. I know people have created the recipe. Michael had a thing about cayenne pepper and cinnamon. I'm just telling you.
That made for one quite remarkable, certainly very memorable episode.
Alison, the two of us did this. We did it on the fly. It was like, it was one take. We did it. I mean, we each did our coverage of the scene in one take, gulping water, all of that. I think fans have loved that moment for years. It's really one of the few scenes I did with Alison during those years. I mean, we were in a lot of scenes together, but we didn't do a lot of scenes together. That was one of the few, and that was a memorable connection to Nellie Olson.
Tell me about Melissa Gilbert, because you two had the most incredible on-screen chemistry.
I think our relationship through those years working together was very careful, because I think that it had to be dealt with carefully. I could never really Melissa and I we were colleagues then. We will always be colleagues. Now we can be friends. The 8 years difference between us means nothing now. But at the time, that was a big deal. I mean, Melissa has always been fearless, even though she had all this anxiety about what we were doing together. But you never saw that on her face. You never knew that Melissa was nervous, uncomfortable. She said to me later, years later, I had this fear that I was going to be this terrible disappointment to you. I mean, how could Melissa Gilbert be a disappointment? I mean, Melissa was just, I think, when you look at juvenile young actresses of her era and of any era, Melissa would have to rank right up there in the top 4 or 5 young actresses ever to work in front of a camera in Hollywood. But we were very careful in this relationship. We rehearsed nicely together. Sometimes we butted heads about the intention of a scene or how we were going to play a moment. I always remember, Craig, a moment when she and I did have a disagreement about an intention in a scene, and I wanted to play it one way and she wanted to play it a different way. And actors work these things out, but she wasn't going to take that to chance. She went to Michael and said, Dean can't play this like this. And Michael watched the rehearsal, and he came up to me and he said, just so you know, if there's ever a question about how something's going to get played and there's a disagreement between you and Melissa, it's always going to be her way 100% of the time.
Right.
So, I knew where I stood in that situation. And, that was that didn't happen all the time, but when she needed to flex her muscles, she wasn't afraid to do that. And Michael adored her and she adored him. And so he was going to be very protective of her.
You had the chance to work with somebody who was very young, has gone on to have an extraordinary career. I'm talking about Shannen Doherty. Now, she played Jenny Wilder. I think that was her first major television role. As I say, she was very young. Did you, Dean, see that it factor back then? Was there that certain something about Shannen Doherty that made you think she's going to go on and achieve? She's going to be great on screen?
There was no doubt. You could see it instantly that Shannen wanted it, and she was prepared to do whatever she needed to do to get there. And this is remarkable for a girl 11, 12 years old to have that kind of intention. Shannen was calling her publicist 3 times a day.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Well, who was doing that at that age? I mean, Shannen Doherty was doing that at that age. And that demonstrated to all of us that there was quite a life force working there.
Yep. And she meant business, didn't she? And of course, she did mean business, and she wound up becoming one of the big stars of Beverly Hills 90210 and beyond. And now, very sadly, she's dealing with cancer.
My wife, Catherine, played Tori Spelling's mom on 90210. She knew right away that Shannen had this muscle about her. Yes, and there's no quite. Shannen is in a very challenging point in her life now.
Another special talent, of course, was Catherine McGregor, one of the greats, and she gave you a lot of really interesting, wise advice, didn't she?
I absolutely adored her. Catherine talk about someone with a motor. I mean, Catherine was thinking about her acting morning, noon, and night. She absolutely loved this work and was so devoted to it, energized by it, committed to it. She was all in all the time, and she was fascinating to talk to about acting. And Michael didn't have time to talk to me. He was a young guy on the set. Michael didn't have time to talk to me about acting. He was just so busy, cranking it out. Catherine loved talking about acting, and I was very receptive to listening to her talk about it. And she had, so interesting to watch that character evolve. When Little House began, Mrs. Olson was sort of a little dour, very severe, not much humor there in the beginning. When Catherine discovered the humor that was possible to mine in this character, it just exploded. That her wonderful sense of fun, going from being someone who would be feared to someone who was foolish. Mm-hmm. And that was the big difference for her. She needed people to love to hate her, to enjoy hating her. And that's where she started mining the humor in this. And once she saw that and felt that, and she was affirmed with this humor by everyone around her. When people saw that and felt that coming from her, that was encouraged. And when the writers started seeing her humor come out in dailies, they just started feeding that.
Look, that show turned you into a sex symbol, Dean. It really did. There was that dazzling smile, the blonde hair.
I was an object, Craig. I was just an object.
Were there ladies throwing themselves at you in the street or in restaurants and so forth? Did it reach that level of crazy?
I certainly had my fair share of opportunity to spend time with some very attractive women.
So poetically put, Dean, you have a wonderful way of description.
I was look, I was genetically blessed by my parents. If anybody who's in my book, which is coming out soon, there are some pictures of my parents as a young couple, and they were a beautiful, beautiful couple. And I got that genetic, I got my genetic talent from them.
Your fans are in for a real thrill because you've written a book. It's called Prairie Man, My Little House, Life and Beyond. You've got it right there in your hot little hand, haven't you, Dean Butler?
This is actually a reader's copy. It's not out yet. It is coming out June 25th. It's available for pre-order on Amazon and at Barnes and Noble digitally. I hope people, if they want the book, will walk into their bookstores and ask for it, so that a bookstore will benefit from having the book. But it's been quite an adventure. Craig, I never thought I was going to write a book. I sort of struggled with it, thinking, what do I have to say that's different? And spent more time thinking about it and realized, well, my point of view about it is my point of view. No one else is exactly my point of view. I mean, Melissa had her point of view. Alison had her point of view. Karen had her point of view. Charlotte Stewart's had her point of view. Ketty Lester had her point of view about the series. The only man that I'm aware of who's directly written a book that included Little House was our late producer, Kent McCrae, who wrote a wonderful book about his career in television and wrote beautifully about Little House in that. But other than that, no other man in our cast has ever written anything. And I thought, well, this is my time. June 25th is the date, and it was quite an adventure. It's fun when you start peeling back the memories of your life. And I'm going to tell you, this is a book for fans. It's a book for people who love these programs, who are intrigued with that era in television. And hopefully I've done that some justice. It's an authentic telling of my life in those times, and a little bit of the setup of my life, that how my family influenced me to be who I became. I'm very grateful to my own family for shaping me to be the man that I have become.
And you referenced your wife, Catherine Cannon, a wonderful actor. There's a Michael Landon connection because, is this right? You met at an audition for a Western series that he was looking to get together. Is that right?
Michael wanted to write a new series, and that series was called Father Murphy. And Catherine come out to Big Sky Movie Ranch, where we were shooting that day, and read with Michael in the makeup trailer. And Catherine, I just remember behind me sitting there in this audition, high Dean, and I turned around and there's beautiful Catherine Cannon sitting there looking spectacular. I just looked at her and said, I want to see you again. And I asked her for her phone number. And, 28 years later, we're still building a life together. And having a life together. And I'm really grateful for that.
Now, we began this conversation with us talking about you having had the opportunity to work with the very great Karl Malden. Well, in the 90s, you had an opportunity to work with another of the greats. You worked on stage with the incredible, fabulous, and I can only imagine gorgeous Carol Burnett, true bona fide legend.
Carol, obviously famous for her comedic chops, but quite the dramatic actress as
Yes.
well. You know, I mean, really, and this, as is so often the case with great comedic actors and actresses, they have this muscle comedically, but boy, the gravitas that's under the surface of that can come into play in dramatic situations, as Carol did in so many things. But I think of a movie that she did for, I believe it was for ABC, called Friendly Fire with Ned Beatty. I'm aware of that one because I almost was cast as her son in that, didn't quite get to the final, but that's where I met her for the first time. And this was a very dramatic, gut-wrenching, heart-wrenching kind of performance that she had to give. This was far from the woman who walked into the scene with the curtain rod in her dress being, you know, doing the Scarlett O'Hara moment.
That's right.
She is a very special talent.
Well, these days you're still very much in the biz, but you focus behind the scenes now, really, don't you? Pulling together documentaries, sporting specials for television, and so on. So you're still very much a busy, incredibly creative man.
You know, it's interesting. I mean, I loved being an actor. When I really started to get serious about transitioning out of that and discovered producing and working behind the scenes, I really came to the conclusion that the people who work behind the camera really have the most fun in all of this, because they're there from the very beginning to the end of every project. They're there from the idea to the fruition of that idea. Actors are the last ones hired. They're the first ones done. They're essential to the process. You've got to have the actors to do these things, but the actors are, and they get so much credit for it, but really the people who are there months, if not years beforehand, and months, if not years after the actors have worked, they're the ones who have really had the joy of creation. And I appreciate that part of it so much, because you really can own it at that point. As an actor, you're a part of it, but as a producer, you really own the thing, and because it's come out of your head.
Dean, I have to say it has been a total, utter, unmitigated joy chatting with you.
I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to talk about Into the Woods and Stephen Sondheim and James Lapine and Broadway and all of that, but you know, it's in the book.
Yeah, well, that's right. It's in. You know what? You got to leave something between your covers.
Yeah. Let's leave something unsaid.
Thank you so much for what has been a really good, long-winded chin wag. I've enjoyed every second of it.
Thanks, Craig, and thank you, Kelley. This is lovely. This is one of the nicer conversations I've had during this, so I really appreciate it.